The scream tore through the ballroom just as Fiona Crawford's champagne glass touched her lips, and before anyone could process what was happening, flames erupted from the manor's east wing like a living creature hungry for destruction. Fiona dropped her glass, the crystal shattering against marble as chaos consumed the elegant charity gala. Women in designer gowns stumbled over each other, men in tuxedos shoved past anyone in their path, and the acrid smell of smoke began filtering through the ventilation system. She stood frozen for a heartbeat, watching the orange glow reflecting off the grand windows, before her mind kicked into survival mode. "Everyone out!" someone shouted, but the order was redundant as guests trampled toward the exits in a surge of panic. Fiona moved against the crowd, her heart pounding as she remembered the staff quarters on the second floor. Maria, the elderly housekeeper who had been kind to her all evening, had mentioned feeling unwell and retiring early. The realization hit Fiona like ice water. Maria's room was in the east wing. She pushed through the fleeing crowd, her emerald evening gown catching on chairs as she fought her way to the servants' staircase. Heat pressed against her skin even from this distance, and smoke was beginning to pour through the hallways in thick, choking clouds. Behind her, she could hear security trying to do head counts, their voices frantic and desperate. The staircase was already hazy with smoke, and Fiona pulled her shawl over her nose and mouth as she climbed, each breath burning in her lungs. The second floor was worse. The wallpaper was bubbling from the heat, and the roar of flames echoed through the corridor like a beast awakening. She could feel the temperature rising with each step, her skin prickling with the promise of pain. "Maria!" Fiona called out, her voice muffled by the fabric. "Maria, can you hear me?" A weak cough answered from down the hall, and Fiona ran toward it, her heels abandoned somewhere on the stairs. The smoke was so thick now she could barely see 3 feet ahead, her eyes watering and stinging. She found Maria's door and tried the handle, yanking her hand back with a hiss as the hot metal burned her palm. "Maria, I'm getting you out!" Fiona shouted, slamming her shoulder against the door. Once, twice, 3 times, and finally it gave way, sending her stumbling into the room. Maria lay on the bed, overcome by smoke, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Fiona grabbed the woman under her arms and dragged her toward the door, her muscles screaming with the effort. The elderly housekeeper was heavier than she looked, and Fiona's lungs were burning, each breath a struggle against the toxic air. They made it to the hallway just as part of the ceiling collapsed behind them, sending a shower of sparks and debris across the corridor. Fiona screamed, pulling Maria closer to the wall, but she could see now that their path back to the stairs was blocked. Flames licked up the walls on both sides, and the heat was becoming unbearable. "No, no, no," Fiona gasped, looking around desperately for another way out. The main staircase was on the other side of the fire, and the servants' stairs were blocked. They were trapped. She pulled Maria toward the nearest window, but they were on the second floor too high to jump without serious injury. Below, she could see emergency vehicles arriving, their lights painting the night in red and blue, but they seemed impossibly far away. The fire was spreading faster now, consuming everything in its path, and Fiona realized with terrible clarity that they might not make it out. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Maria, though the woman was barely conscious. "I'm so sorry." That's when she felt a presence behind her, something that made every hair on her body stand on end. Not the fire, not the smoke, but something else. Something predatory and ancient and impossibly cold despite the inferno surrounding them. Fiona turned, and through the smoke, she saw him. He stood in the flames as though they couldn't touch him, tall and impossibly regal, with skin as pale as moonlight and hair the color of fresh snow that fell past his shoulders. His eyes were the deep crimson of old blood, and they fixed on her with an intensity that stole what little breath she had left. He wore a black suit that seemed untouched by the destruction around him, and his expression was one of cold assessment. "You're either incredibly brave or remarkably foolish," he said, his voice smooth and accented with something old-world and indefinable. "I haven't decided which." "Who?" Fiona's question dissolved into a coughing fit, and she sank to her knees, still gripping Maria's unconscious form. The man moved toward her with inhuman speed, crossing the burning hallway in less than a heartbeat. Up close, he was even more striking beautiful in a way that seemed almost painful to look at, with sharp features that belonged on ancient statues and an aura of power that made the air around him feel heavy. "The ceiling is about to collapse," he stated matter-of-factly, glancing up at the groaning structure above them. "You have perhaps 30 seconds before this entire wing comes down." "Then help us," Fiona gasped, her vision starting to blur from the smoke. "Please." Those crimson eyes studied her for a moment longer, and Fiona saw something flicker in their depths, surprise perhaps, or curiosity. Then he moved, scooping Maria into his arms with effortless strength before turning back to Fiona. "Can you hold on to me?" he asked. Fiona nodded, not trusting her voice, and he shifted Maria to one arm before reaching down and pulling Fiona against his side. His body was cold, impossibly so, like being pressed against marble that had been kept in a freezer, but the chill was relief against her overheated skin. "Hold tight," he commanded, and then they were moving. Fiona had never experienced anything like it. He moved through the flames and smoke as though they were merely inconvenient, his speed so great that the world became a blur around them. She felt the heat recede, felt the terrible weight of the smoke lift from her lungs, and then suddenly they were outside in the cool night air. The man set them down on the lawn far from the burning manor, laying Maria gently on the grass before stepping back. Paramedics were already rushing toward them, drawn by the impossible sight of 3 people appearing out of nowhere, but the white-haired man was already turning away. "Wait!" Fiona called out, her voice hoarse but urgent. "Who are you?" He paused, glancing back at her over his shoulder. In the light from the fire, his pale features seemed to glow, otherworldly and magnificent. "Hadrian Nyx," he said simply. "And you should be more careful about running into burning buildings, Miss Crawford." "How do you know my—" But he was gone, disappearing into the shadows between emergency vehicles so quickly that Fiona wondered if she had imagined the entire encounter. Then the paramedics were surrounding her, and Maria was being loaded onto a stretcher, and there was no time to think about crimson eyes or impossible speed or skin as cold as death. It wasn't until much later, after she'd been checked for smoke inhalation and released from the hospital, after she'd given her statement to the fire marshal and the police, after she'd finally made it back to her apartment as dawn was breaking, that Fiona allowed herself to really think about what had happened. Hadrian Nyx. The name rolled through her mind like distant thunder. She pulled out her laptop, ignoring the way her hands were still shaking, and typed the name into the search engine. The results were sparse, a few mentions in historical texts, some obscure references in old society pages from decades past, but nothing concrete. The photos she found were grainy and old, but there was no mistaking those features, that pale hair. "Impossible," Fiona whispered to her empty apartment. But she had seen him, felt his impossible coldness, witnessed his inhuman speed, and those eyes, those red eyes that seemed to look right through her, ancient and knowing and far too aware. The sun was fully up now, streaming through her windows, and exhaustion was finally catching up with her. Fiona closed her laptop and stumbled to her bedroom, but sleep was elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw flames and smoke, felt the terrible heat, and then felt that shocking cold as Hadrian had pulled her against him. She didn't know how she knew, but she was certain she would see him again. The certainty settled in her bones like knowledge rather than hope, and it should have frightened her more than it did. 3 days passed before her instinct proved correct. Fiona had returned to work at the architectural firm where she was a junior designer, throwing herself into projects to avoid thinking about the fire. The manor had been a total loss, and 2 staff members had died despite the heroic efforts of firefighters. Maria had survived thanks to Fiona's rescue, and the elderly woman had been released from the hospital with a grateful family surrounding her. The local news had called Fiona a hero, but she felt like a fraud. She hadn't saved Maria Hadrian. Nyx had saved them both, but how could she explain that to reporters without sounding insane? She was working late on a Thursday, alone in the office as she refined drawings for a new residential project, when the temperature in the room dropped. It was subtle at first, just a slight chill, but within seconds her breath was fogging in the air and goosebumps were racing down her arms. "You've been researching me," a familiar voice said from behind her. Fiona spun in her chair, her heart leaping into her throat. Hadrian Nyx stood near the windows, somehow having appeared in her 6th-floor office without opening the door. He looked exactly as she remembered, pale and regal, in an impeccably tailored black suit, his white hair catching the fluorescent lights like spun silver. "How did you get in here?" Fiona demanded, trying to sound brave despite the tremor in her voice. "The window," He gestured casually at the glass behind him, which was definitely closed and locked. "We're 6 floors up." "Yes?" He said it as though that explained everything, moving closer with that same fluid grace she remembered from the fire. "You didn't tell anyone about me. Why?" Fiona stood, wanting the slight advantage of height even though he still towered over her. "Would anyone have believed me? A mysterious stranger who walks through fire and moves faster than humanly possible?" She paused, studying his face. "Because you're not human, are you?" Something flickered in those crimson eyes. Approval, perhaps. "Most people prefer not to see what's right in front of them. It's a survival instinct, I suppose. Safer to rationalize than to acknowledge that monsters are real." "Are you a monster?" The question came out softer than she intended, more curious than afraid. Hadrian tilted his head, considering her. "I'm a vampire, Miss Crawford. Whether that makes me a monster depends entirely on your perspective." The words should have sent her running, screaming for help, barricading herself behind whatever protection she could find. Instead, Fiona felt a strange calm settle over her, like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. It made sense, the pale skin, the red eyes, the inhuman abilities, the way he'd appeared and disappeared that night. "Why did you save me?" she asked. "And Maria? Why were you at the manor at all?" "I was invited to the gala," Hadrian said, a hint of amusement in his tone. "Contrary to popular belief, we do participate in society. As for why I saved you..." He paused, and for the first time, something uncertain crossed his features. "I'm not entirely sure myself. You ran into a burning building for someone you barely knew. It seemed a waste to let such courage go unrewarded." "You were invited?" Fiona latched onto that detail. "But the fire started around 10, and the sun would have just set. How did you..." "You're quick." Hadrian's expression shifted into something that might have been respect. "Yes, sunlight is problematic for my kind. I arrived after dark, naturally. As for the fire..." His face hardened. "It was not an accident." "What do you mean?" "I mean someone set that fire deliberately, knowing I would be there, knowing that many of my kind would be there." He moved to her desk, picking up a pen and examining it with idle curiosity. The manor belonged to a human family sympathetic to vampires. The gala was a gathering place for both species. Someone wanted to send a message. "A message?" Fiona's mind was racing, trying to keep up. "Who? Why?" "There are factions within the human world who know of us and wish us destroyed. And there are factions within my world who believe humans should be cattle, not equals." Hadrian set the pen down with precise care. The fire could have been started by either, and that ambiguity is precisely the point, to create suspicion, to break down the fragile peace we've built. "This is insane," Fiona breathed, sinking back into her chair. "This is completely insane." "Yes?" Hadrian's tone was dry. "Welcome to my reality." They stared at each other for a long moment, the office silent except for the hum of Fiona's computer and the distant sound of traffic from the streets below. Fiona should have been terrified, but instead, she felt energized, alive in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "Why are you telling me all this?" she finally asked. "Because you were there. Because you're connected to this now, whether you like it or not." Hadrian's expression turned serious. "And because whoever started that fire is going to notice that you survived. A human woman who ran into the flames and came out unscathed, carried by a vampire that makes you interesting. And interesting is dangerous." The implication settled over Fiona like cold water. "You're saying I'm in danger." "I'm saying you need to be careful, aware." He pulled a card from his jacket and placed it on her desk. "If anything unusual happens, contact me immediately." Fiona picked up the card. It was heavy stock, cream-colored, with a phone number embossed in silver, and nothing else. "That's it? Just a phone number?" "What more do you need?" "I don't know, an address, an email, a way to verify this isn't all some elaborate fever dream?" Fiona heard the edge of hysteria in her own voice and took a breath. "I'm sorry. This is a lot to process." "I know." Hadrian's voice softened slightly. "For what it's worth, I wish you'd never been involved, but you are, and pretending otherwise would put you in greater danger." He moved toward the window, and Fiona realized he was leaving. "Wait," she called out, standing. "The fire, are you investigating it? Trying to find out who's responsible?" Yes. Then let me help. The words were out before Fiona could think them through, but once spoken, she didn't take them back. I'm an architect. I know buildings, how they're constructed, how fires spread. And I was there, I might remember something useful. Hadrian turned back to her, his expression unreadable. This isn't a game, Miss Crawford. The people involved in this human or vampire are dangerous. They've already proven they're willing to kill. I know. I was there, remember? I saw what they did. Fiona crossed her arms, channeling every ounce of confidence she possessed. And you just said I'm already involved, so I can either sit around waiting to be a target or I can do something about it. I prefer the latter. For a long moment, Hadrian simply studied her, his ancient eyes seeming to catalog every detail of her face. Then, slowly, he smiled a real smile that transformed his severe features into something breathtaking. Very well, he said, but we do this my way, on my terms. You follow my instructions without question. Agreed? Agreed, Fiona said, hoping she wasn't making a terrible mistake. Then meet me tomorrow night at the remains of the manor, 10 o'clock. Don't be late. He opened the window as though the lock didn't exist, letting in a rush of cool night air. And Miss Crawford? Call me Hadrian. If we're going to be working together, we might as well dispense with the formalities. Fiona, she offered in return. Just Fiona. He nodded once, then stepped through the window and was gone, disappearing into the night as though he'd never been there at all. Fiona rushed to the window, looking down at the street below, but there was no sign of him. He had simply vanished. She looked down at the card in her hand, running her thumb over the embossed numbers. A vampire. She was working with a vampire to solve an arson case that might involve supernatural conspiracies. Her life had officially departed from anything resembling normal. But as Fiona gathered her things and headed home, she couldn't deny the thrill running through her veins. For the first time since moving to the city 3 years ago, trying to build a career and a life from nothing, she felt like she was part of something significant, something real, even if that something might get her killed. The next evening found Fiona standing in front of the burned-out shell of the manor, her practical clothes and flashlight feeling inadequate for the task ahead. The building was a skeleton now, its elegant facade reduced to blackened timber and collapsed walls. Yellow caution tape surrounded the property, and signs warned of structural instability. You came. Hadrian's voice came from behind her, and Fiona forced herself not to jump. I said I would. She turned to face him, noting that he looked even more striking in the moonlight, his pale features almost luminous. Do you always sneak up on people? It's not sneaking if I'm simply moving at my natural pace. There was amusement in his tone. Come. The fire marshal's investigation is complete, so we won't be interrupted. He ducked under the caution tape and moved toward the building with confidence. Fiona followed, her flashlight beam dancing over the destruction. The smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air, mixed with the acrid scent of melted plastic and burned chemicals. What exactly are we looking for? Fiona asked, carefully stepping over debris. Evidence of accelerants, unusual burn patterns, anything that might indicate this was more than a simple electrical fire. Hadrian moved through the ruins with purpose, his night vision clearly superior to hers. The official investigation concluded it was faulty wiring, but I don't believe in convenient coincidences. They spent the next hour examining what remained of the manor's east wing. Fiona found herself falling into a professional mindset, analyzing the structural damage and the way the fire had spread. Something about the pattern bothered her, but she couldn't quite identify what. Hadrian, she called out, standing in what had once been a storage room. Look at this. He appeared at her side instantly, making her heart skip. She was never going to get used to that speed. The burn pattern here, Fiona pointed at the wall, tracing the darker areas with her flashlight. It doesn't make sense. If the fire started in the electrical system like the report says, it should have spread upward first, following the wiring. But this looks like it started low and spread in multiple directions at once. Hadrian crouched down, running his pale fingers over the scorched floor. Multiple points of ignition, he murmured. You're right. This was definitely arson. He looked up at her, and there was approval in those crimson eyes. Good catch. The praise warmed her more than it should have. But how did they do it? There should have been accelerant residue. And the investigators would have found that, unless they used something the standard tests wouldn't detect. Hadrian stood, brushing ash from his hands. There are substances in the vampire world, chemicals we've developed over centuries, that burn hot and fast but leave almost no trace. If someone had access to those, then it was a vampire who started the fire. Fiona felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air, or a human with vampire connections. The network of cooperation between our species runs deeper than most realize. He paused, his expression darkening. But if it was one of my kind, that narrows the suspects considerably. Not many would have both the access and the motive. Who? Fiona pressed. Who would want to start this war you mentioned? Before Hadrian could answer, a sound echoed through the ruins, the crunch of footsteps on debris. Multiple footsteps, moving with purpose. Hadrian's entire demeanor changed in an instant, his body shifting into a predatory stillness that made Fiona's survival instincts scream. "Get behind me," he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that demanded obedience. Fiona moved immediately, pressing herself against his back as 5 figures emerged from the shadows. They were dressed in black tactical gear, their faces covered, and each carried weapons that gleamed in the moonlight. "Well," one of them said, his voice muffled by his mask, "looks like the rumors were true. The Vampire King himself, investigating the scene of the crime." He raised his weapon, not a gun, Fiona realized, but something else, something with a strange barrel and unusual shape. And he brought a pet. How sweet. "Leave now," Hadrian said, his voice dropping into a register that made Fiona's bones vibrate, "and I might let you live." The man laughed. "Big words for someone who's outnumbered and outgunned. Did you know we developed a new weapon? Compressed ultraviolet light, concentrated enough to burn vampire flesh on contact. Want to see how it works?" Everything happened at once. The man fired his weapon, a beam of bright light shooting toward them. Hadrian moved faster than Fiona's eyes could track, shoving her to the side as he dodged. But the ruins offered little cover, and 3 more beams lanced out from different directions. Fiona hit the ground hard, her flashlight skittering away into the darkness. She heard Hadrian growl an inhuman sound that raised the hair on her neck, and then there was chaos. The attackers were shooting at him from multiple angles, their UV weapons lighting up the night, and Hadrian was moving between the beams with impossible grace. But even he couldn't dodge everything. One beam caught his shoulder, and Fiona heard him hiss in pain. The smell of burning flesh reached her nose, making her stomach turn. "Stop!" she screamed, not knowing what else to do. "Leave him alone!" One of the attackers turned toward her voice, and Fiona saw the weapon swivel in her direction. Terror froze her for a heartbeat as she realized she was about to die. But then Hadrian was there, putting himself between her and the weapon. The UV beam hit him square in the chest, and he staggered, smoke rising from his body. "Hadrian!" Fiona reached for him, but he caught her wrist with an iron grip. "Run!" he ground out through clenched teeth. "Now! I'm not leaving you. Run!" The command was absolute, laced with power that made her body move before her brain could protest. Fiona found herself sprinting away from the ruins, away from Hadrian and the attackers, her legs pumping with desperate speed. She made it to the road before her own will reasserted itself. She couldn't leave him. Whatever he was, whatever danger he represented, he had saved her life twice now. And she was not the kind of person who abandoned someone in need. Fiona spun around, searching for anything that could help. Her eyes landed on a piece of rebar protruding from a chunk of concrete. It wasn't much, but it was something. She grabbed it, the metal heavy and cold in her hands, and ran back toward the ruins. The scene she returned to was carnage. 3 of the attackers were down, unconscious or worse, their bodies crumpled in unnatural positions. The other 2 were backing away from Hadrian, who stood in the center of the destruction, looking like death incarnate. His suit was burned in several places, his pale skin blistered and angry where the UV light had hit him, but his eyes blazed with fury. "You made a mistake coming here," Hadrian said, his voice echoing with otherworldly power. "You made a mistake attacking me, but your greatest mistake—" His eyes flicked to where Fiona stood at the edge of the ruins, rebar raised like a weapon. Was threatening her. He moved then, so fast he seemed to simply appear in front of the remaining attackers. What happened next was over in seconds. Hadrian disarmed them both, crushing their UV weapons with casual strength before grabbing each by the throat and lifting them off their feet. "Who sent you?" he demanded. The men struggled, choking, but neither answered. Hadrian's grip tightened, his face a mask of cold rage, and Fiona realized he was going to kill them. "Wait," she called out, running forward. "Hadrian, wait, don't kill them." His eyes found hers, still blazing with that inhuman fury. "They tried to kill you." "I know, but if you kill them, we'll never find out who's behind this." Fiona forced herself to stay calm, to hold his gaze. "We need them alive. We need answers." For a long, terrible moment, she thought he wouldn't listen. Then, slowly, the rage in his expression banked, replaced by something more controlled. He dropped the men, who collapsed to the ground, gasping and coughing. "Bind them," Hadrian ordered, his eyes never leaving Fiona. "There's rope in the car parked behind the west fence. The black sedan." Fiona found the rope and returned to help secure the attackers. Hadrian watched her work with an expression she couldn't read, and only when the men were safely restrained did he finally relax his stance. "You came back," he said quietly. "Of course I came back." Fiona gestured at the unconscious men. "What are we going to do with them?" "I have contacts who will extract the information we need." Hadrian swayed slightly, and Fiona realized just how badly he was hurt. The burns on his exposed skin looked painful, and she could see more injuries beneath the burned areas of his clothing. "You need help," she said, moving to his side. "Medical attention or whatever vampires do when they're injured." "Blood," Hadrian said bluntly. "I need blood to heal, but that's not something I can acquire easily in the field." Fiona didn't think, didn't let herself hesitate. "Take mine." His eyes widened, genuine shock crossing his features. "What?" "You saved my life. Again. And you got hurt protecting me." She held out her wrist. "So take what you need to heal." "Fiona, you don't understand what you're offering. Feeding is it's intimate, sacred to my kind, and dangerous. I could lose control, take too much, hurt you." "But you won't," Fiona said with more confidence than she felt. "I trust you." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Finally, Hadrian reached out and took her wrist with gentle fingers, his touch impossibly cold. "This will hurt," he warned. "I know." He raised her wrist to his mouth, and Fiona felt his breath ghost across her skin, cold like the rest of him. Then his fangs pierced her flesh, and she gasped at the sharp pain. But the pain faded almost immediately, replaced by a strange warmth that spread from the bite up her arm. It wasn't unpleasant. In fact, it was almost Fiona cut that thought off, focusing instead on Hadrian's face. His eyes had closed, and his expression was one of intense concentration, mixed with something that looked almost like bliss. She could feel her blood flowing out, but also feel his power flowing in, a strange exchange that left her lightheaded and strangely connected to him. After what felt like both seconds and hours, Hadrian pulled back, licking the wound to seal it. When he opened his eyes, they glowed even brighter than before, and his injuries were already visibly healing, the burns fading to pink skin and then to his normal pallor. Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "That was a gift I don't deserve." "Nonsense," Fiona flexed her hand, noting the 2 small marks on her wrist with strange satisfaction. "Partners help each other, right?" "Partners," Hadrian repeated, something warm entering his expression. "Yes, I suppose we are." They stood there for a moment, neither quite willing to break the connection. Then Fiona's phone buzzed, shattering the spell. She pulled it out to find a text from her boss, reminding her about a morning meeting. "I have to go," she said reluctantly. "Work stuff. But call me when you find out who these people are." "I will." Hadrian stepped back, his professional mask sliding back into place. "And Fiona, be careful. Whoever hired these men now knows you're with me. That makes you a target." "Then I guess it's lucky I have a vampire king watching my back," Fiona said with more bravado than she felt. She left him there in the ruins, but she felt his eyes on her all the way to her car. And when she finally made it home, cleaned up and collapsed into bed, she dreamed of crimson eyes and cold hands and the strange, intoxicating warmth of that bite. The next week passed in a blur of normalcy that felt increasingly surreal. Fiona went to work, attended meetings, worked on her projects, and pretended that her life hadn't been turned completely upside down. But every night, she found herself checking her phone obsessively, waiting for word from Hadrian. It finally came on Thursday, a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at the address below, 8 p.m. Come alone." The address led her to an upscale building in the city's historic district, the kind of place that looked like it had been standing for centuries. The doorman waved her through as though expecting her, and an ancient elevator carried her to the top floor. Hadrian was waiting in the penthouse apartment, standing by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering city. He looked completely healed from the attack, dressed in another impeccable suit, his white hair pulled back in a way that emphasized his sharp features. "Welcome to my home," he said, gesturing around the space. Fiona looked around with an architect's eye, noting the blend of modern amenities and antique furniture. Everything spoke of wealth and taste accumulated over lifetimes. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "How long have you lived here?" "I bought this building in 1923, Hadrian said. "The penthouse has been my primary residence ever since." The casual mention of a century of residence drove home just how different their existences were. Fiona was 26. Hadrian was... She didn't even know how old he actually was. "You said you had information?" she prompted, setting her bag down on a leather chair. The men from the Manor talked. Eventually, Hadrian's expression was grim. They were hired by a group calling themselves the Purification Front, human extremists who believe vampires are an abomination that must be eradicated. Extremists? Fiona felt cold. How big is this group? Big enough to be concerning. They have cells across the country, access to advanced weapons, and apparently at least one source inside the vampire community feeding them information. He moved to a table where a laptop sat open, showing what looked like surveillance photos. But here's where it gets interesting. The fire at the Manor? It wasn't just about killing vampires. It was also meant to destroy evidence. Evidence of what? The Manor's owner, a human named Richard Thornton, had been documenting illegal activities, smuggling, trafficking, violations of the treaty between humans and vampires. He was planning to go public with his findings. Hadrian pulled up a photo of a middle-aged man with kind eyes. The fire destroyed his evidence and killed him before he could expose anyone. Fiona studied the photos, her mind working through the implications. So the Purification Front was covering up crimes. But why would human extremists care about protecting vampires? Because they weren't protecting vampires. They were protecting their own. Hadrian's voice was hard. The trafficking Thornton discovered? It was humans selling other humans to rogue vampires, the worst kind of exploitation, preying on the vulnerable for profit. Oh, God! Fiona sat down heavily, feeling sick. So these extremists don't actually care about purifying anything. They just want to eliminate anyone who threatens their business. Exactly. They use anti-vampire rhetoric to recruit believers, but their real motivation is money and power. Hadrian closed the laptop with controlled violence. And now they know we're investigating, which means they'll come after us again, harder this time. Then we need to stop them before they can. Fiona looked up at him, determination hardening in her chest. We need to find their operation and expose them. With Thornton's evidence gone, we'll need new proof. We? Hadrian raised an eyebrow. Fiona, this is beyond dangerous now. These people are organized, well-funded, and absolutely ruthless. I can't guarantee your safety. I'm not asking you to. She stood, moving closer to him. I'm asking to help finish what Richard Thornton started. Those people died in that fire. They deserve justice. Hadrian studied her for a long moment, and Fiona met his gaze without flinching. Finally, he sighed, a very human gesture that somehow made him seem more approachable. You're impossibly stubborn, he said, but there was warmth in his voice. I prefer to think of it as determined. Fiona glanced back at the laptop. So where do we start? There's a warehouse on the East Docks. My sources suggest it's being used as a hub for the trafficking operation. Hadrian pulled up a map on his phone, showing her the location. I was planning to investigate tonight. Then I'm coming with you. Fiona, partners, remember? She held up her wrist where the bite marks from a week ago had faded to 2 small scars. You can't back out now. Hadrian's eyes lingered on those scars, and something heated flickered in his expression. Those marks suit you, he said quietly. In my world, they mean you're under my protection, that anyone who harms you answers to me. The possessive intensity in his voice sent a shiver down Fiona's spine that had nothing to do with fear. Is that so? Yes. He stepped closer, and suddenly the air between them felt charged. You should know when a vampire feeds from someone. It creates a connection. I can sense you now, feel when you're in danger or distress. It's why I knew you were truly willing that night, why I knew I could stop before taking too much. That doesn't sound like a bad thing, Fiona said, her voice coming out softer than intended. Being connected. They stood there, mere inches apart, and Fiona was acutely aware of every detail, his height, his cold scent like winter air, the way his eyes had darkened to the color of burgundy wine. She should step back, maintain some professional distance, but she found she didn't want to. Fiona, Hadrian said, her name almost a warning, you should know that vampires feel things intensely. When we form attachments, they're not casual, and I'm finding myself very attached to you. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Is that a problem? It could be. I'm dangerous, and my world is dangerous. You've already seen that. He raised one hand, hesitating, then gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were cold against her skin. But I also find I don't want to let you go. Then don't, Fiona whispered. The space between them disappeared. Hadrian's mouth found hers in a kiss that was cold and intense and utterly intoxicating. Fiona's hands found his shoulders, pulling him closer, despite or perhaps because of his inhuman nature. This was madness, kissing a vampire, but it felt more real than anything she'd experienced in years. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily well. Fiona was breathing heavily. She wasn't entirely sure Hadrian needed to breathe at all. He rested his forehead against hers. This complicates things, he murmured. Most worthwhile things are complicated, Fiona replied, her fingers still clutching his jacket. He laughed, a sound of genuine warmth. True enough. Then he pulled back, his expression turning serious again. But if we're going to do this, investigate these criminals, pursue whatever this is between us, I need to know you understand the risks. Not just the physical danger, but the social implications. The vampire world has rules, hierarchies, politics. Getting involved with me puts you in the middle of all that. I'm already in the middle of it, Fiona pointed out. The moment you carried me out of that fire, I became part of your world, so we can either fight it or we can accept it and move forward. When did you become so wise? Hadrian asked, a slight smile playing at his lips. I've always been wise. You're just now noticing. They spent the next hour planning their approach to the warehouse investigation. Hadrian outlined the potential dangers, the contingencies, the escape routes. Fiona contributed her knowledge of building structures, suggesting entry points and ways to move through the space safely. You're good at this, Hadrian observed as they finalized their plan. Strategy, I mean. Have you done this kind of thing before? Only in video games, Fiona admitted. But I've always been good at spatial reasoning and problem solving. Architecture is basically just creative problem solving with pretty results. Remind me to introduce you to some of our vampire architects. They'd be fascinated by your modern perspective. He glanced at his watch, an elegant piece that probably cost more than Fiona's car. We should leave soon. The warehouse should be at minimal staffing around 11. They took Hadrian's car, a sleek black vehicle that probably had some exotic name Fiona couldn't pronounce. He drove fast but competently, navigating the city streets with the confidence of someone who'd been doing it for decades. Tell me something about yourself, Fiona said as they drove. Something real. I want to know who you are beyond the Vampire King investigating crimes. Hadrian was quiet for a moment, his pale hands steady on the wheel. I was born in 1547. He finally said. In what's now Hungary. I was the third son of a minor noble, which meant I had education and training but no real prospects. I was turned when I was 28 by a vampire who saw potential in me. And the king part? Fiona asked gently. That came much later. I spent centuries just surviving, learning what I'd become, trying to hold on to my humanity. But I watched empires rise and fall, saw countless wars, witnessed incredible cruelty and stunning compassion. Eventually, I realized that vampires needed structure, leadership, someone to negotiate with the human world as it modernized. I stepped into that role about 200 years ago. That's a lot of responsibility. It is, but someone had to do it, and I found I was good at it. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the dashboard lights. What about you? What drives Fiona Crawford to run into burning buildings and investigate supernatural conspiracies? Nothing as dramatic as your story, Fiona said with a slight laugh. I grew up in a small town in Ohio. Ordinary family, ordinary life. My dad was a contractor and I used to help him with projects. That's how I fell in love with buildings, understanding how spaces work. I moved to the city for college, stayed for work, and have been trying to make a name for myself ever since. And your family? Are you close? They died in a car accident 4 years ago, Fiona said quietly. Drunk driver. I was supposed to be in the car with them, but I had stayed late at school to finish a project. Hadrian's hand found hers, giving it a gentle squeeze. I'm sorry. Thank you. It's part of why I ran into the fire for Maria. I know what it's like to lose people, and I couldn't just stand by if there was a chance to save someone. She looked out the window at the passing city lights. Maybe that makes me reckless. It makes you compassionate. Brave. Hadrian's voice was warm. It makes you remarkable. They arrived at the docks as the city clock struck 11. The warehouse was a hulking structure on the waterfront, its windows dark and its perimeter fenced. Hadrian parked several blocks away, and they approached on foot, sticking to the shadows. Stay close to me, Hadrian instructed, and if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments this time. No promises, Fiona replied, earning an exasperated look. They found a side entrance with a rusted lock that Hadrian broke with casual strength. Inside, the warehouse was vast and dark, filled with shipping containers stacked in neat rows. The air smelled of salt water and rust and something else, something organic and wrong. Hadrian tensed immediately. Blood, he said quietly, recent and in large quantities. They moved deeper into the warehouse, following the scent, until they found what they were looking for. A shipping container with its door slightly ajar, light spilling from inside. Hadrian approached silently, peering through the gap, and his expression turned to cold fury. What is it? Fiona whispered. He stepped back, letting her see. Inside the container was set up like a makeshift prison, with cages lining the walls. And in those cages were people pale, malnourished, some conscious and some not. At least a dozen victims trapped in that single container. Oh my God, Fiona breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. This is the trafficking operation, Hadrian said, his voice deadly calm. They're keeping humans here, probably selling them to rogue vampires who don't respect the treaty. This is... He broke off, shaking with rage. This is everything I've fought against for centuries. We need to call the police, Fiona said, pulling out her phone. We need to get these people help immediately. Wait, Hadrian caught her hand. If we call the authorities now, whoever's running this will destroy the evidence and disappear. We need to find proof, documentation, names, something that will bring down the entire organization. But those people, I know, and will free them. But first, let me scout the rest of the warehouse. There must be an office, computers, records. Give me 5 minutes. Fiona wanted to argue, but she could see his logic. 5 minutes, she agreed. Then we're calling for help. Hadrian disappeared into the darkness, moving with his supernatural speed. Fiona stayed by the container, looking at the trapped people and feeling rage build in her chest. How could anyone do this? How could humans treat each other with such cruelty? She was so focused on the victims that she didn't hear the footsteps behind her until it was too late. Well, well, a voice said, and Fiona spun to find a man pointing a gun at her. He was middle-aged, well-dressed, looking completely out of place in the grim warehouse. You must be Hadrian's new pet. He always did have a weakness for idealistic humans. Who are you? Fiona demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. My name is Marcus Kane, and I run this operation. He smiled, and it was the smile of a man without conscience. You and your vampire friend have been causing me a lot of trouble lately. I think it's time we had a chat about that. More men emerged from the shadows, at least 6 of them, all armed. Fiona realized with sinking dread that they'd walked into a trap. You were expecting us, she said. Of course. You're not as subtle as you think. Marcus gestured with his gun. Where's the vampire king? I came alone. Please don't insult my intelligence. He raised his voice. Hadrian Nyx, I know you're here. Show yourself, or I'll put a bullet in your girlfriend's skull. For a terrible moment, there was only silence. Then, Hadrian emerged from the shadows, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, his expression carefully neutral. Let her go, he said calmly. Your quarrel's with me, not her. Oh, but she's so much more useful as leverage. Marcus kept his gun trained on Fiona. You've been investigating my operation, threatening my business. That's bad for profits. You're trafficking humans to rogue vampires, Hadrian said, his voice dripping with contempt. You're violating every treaty, every law, every basic principle of decency. I'm providing a service. Those vampires were going to feed anyway. I'm just making sure it's organized, profitable. Marcus shrugged. You of all people should understand business, Your Majesty. You didn't get to be king by being squeamish. I became king by protecting my people and honoring our agreements with humans. You're a disgrace to both species. Strong words for someone in a very weak position. Marcus nodded to his men. Take them both. We'll deal with the vampire first. I want him to watch his pet die. The men moved forward, but Hadrian was faster. He became a blur of motion, disarming the two closest guards before they could react. But there were too many, and Marcus still had his gun pointed at Fiona. Stop, or I shoot her, Marcus shouted. Hadrian froze, his eyes blazing with fury. One of the guards used the opportunity to jam something against Hadrian's neck, some kind of device that crackled with electricity. Hadrian convulsed and collapsed, his body twitching. UV taser, Marcus explained conversationally. We developed it specifically for troublesome vampires. Delivers concentrated ultraviolet directly into the bloodstream. Quite effective. Hadrian! Fiona tried to run to him, but Marcus grabbed her arm, yanking her back. No, you're going to watch while we make an example of him. Let the vampire world know what happens when they interfere with my business. Two guards lifted Hadrian's semi-conscious form, dragging him toward the center of the warehouse. They chained him to a support pillar, securing him with heavy locks. Fiona struggled against Marcus's grip, but he was stronger than he looked. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus said, pulling out a knife. I'm going to hurt you, slowly, while he watches. When he's sufficiently broken, we'll kill you both and dump your bodies where they'll never be found. He pressed the knife against Fiona's throat, and she felt a bead of blood well up. Across the warehouse, Hadrian's eyes focused, locking onto her with desperate intensity. Don't, Hadrian said, his voice rough. Please, I'll do whatever you want, just don't hurt her. Oh, now we're begging? How the mighty have fallen, Marcus laughed. Sorry, Your Majesty, this is happening. But as Marcus raised the knife for a deeper cut, several things happened at once. The warehouse lights exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging everything into darkness. Hadrian roared a sound of pure fury that echoed off the walls, and the chains holding him shattered with a metallic screech. What? Marcus began, but he never finished the sentence. Hadrian was on him in an instant, moving faster than Fiona's eyes could track even in the darkness. She heard the gun clatter to the floor, heard Marcus scream, and then felt cold hands pulling her away from the chaos. Close your eyes, Hadrian said in her ear, and Fiona obeyed. What followed was violence. She could only hear shouts of alarm, the sounds of fighting, bodies hitting concrete. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like longer. Then there was silence. You can look now, Hadrian said softly. Fiona opened her eyes. The emergency lights had kicked in, bathing the warehouse in dim red. Marcus and his men were unconscious or incapacitated, scattered across the floor like broken dolls. And Hadrian stood in the center of it all, looking like an avenging angel, despite his disheveled appearance. Are you hurt? He asked, moving to her immediately. His cold hands cradled her face, his eyes searching for injuries. I'm okay, just scared. Fiona's hands came up to cover his. What about you? That taser thing. It hurt, but I'll recover, especially since you already gave me some of your blood recently. His thumb brushed over the small cut on her throat, and his expression darkened. He cut you. It's barely a scratch. He touched you, threatened you, used you against me. Hadrian's voice was low and dangerous. I should have killed him. But you didn't, Fiona said firmly, because you're better than that, because we need him alive to testify, to expose this operation. She squeezed his hands. You did the right thing, some of the fury drained from his expression, replaced by something softer. "You have an extraordinary effect on me, Fiona Crawford. You make me want to be the noble vampire of old stories rather than the pragmatic king I've become. Maybe you can be both." Before Hadrian could respond, Fiona's phone rang. She pulled it out, surprised to see an unknown number. "Hello? Miss Crawford, this is Detective Sarah Morrison. We've been monitoring the warehouse based on an anonymous tip about trafficking activity. We're moving in now. Please stay where you are and keep yourself safe." Fiona looked at Hadrian with raised eyebrows. "Did you?" "I sent a message to my contacts in law enforcement before we entered," he admitted. "I wanted backup in case things went wrong. Looks like my timing was fortuitous." Within minutes, the warehouse was swarming with police. They freed the victims from the container, arrested Marcus Kane and his associates, and began documenting the evidence. Hadrian had disappeared into the shadows before the police arrived, leaving Fiona to give her statement alone. She told them about Richard Thornton's investigation, about the fire at the Manor, about tracking the trafficking operation to this warehouse. She left out certain details, like the vampire aspects, but gave them enough to understand the scope of the crimes. "You took a huge risk coming here," Detective Morrison said as she finished taking Fiona's statement. "But you also saved at least 12 lives tonight. Those people are going to get justice because of you." "Not just me," Fiona said. "I had help." The detective glanced around the warehouse. "The anonymous tipster. Are they here? He had to leave, but he's the real hero of this story." By the time Fiona was allowed to leave, dawn was breaking over the city. She found Hadrian waiting in his car several blocks away, watching the sunrise with an expression that was almost wistful. "You can't be out in sunlight," Fiona said as she climbed into the passenger seat. "Not direct sunlight, no, but I can watch it through treated glass." He looked at her and his expression was tender. "I haven't watched a sunrise in nearly 500 years. It's beautiful." "It is," Fiona agreed, though she was looking at him rather than the sky. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, painting the world in shades of gold and pink. Finally, Hadrian spoke. "You should know that what happened tonight, the way I reacted when Marcus threatened you, that's not normal for me. I'm usually controlled, strategic, cold when necessary. But the thought of losing you," he shook his head, "it made me realize how much you've come to mean to me in such a short time." Fiona reached over and took his hand, interlacing their fingers. "I know what you mean. This past week has been insane and terrifying and completely illogical. But also," she paused, searching for the right words, "also the most alive I've felt since my parents died. You've reminded me that there's more to life than just going through the motions." "Fiona, I need you to understand something about vampire relationships. When we love, it's absolute, possessive. We mate for life, and that life can span centuries." His crimson eyes held hers. "If we pursue this, if we let ourselves fall, there's no going back. I will love you for as long as I exist, and I will do everything in my power to keep you with me." "That sounds terrifying," Fiona said honestly, "and also kind of wonderful." "Is that a yes?" "It's a let's see where this goes while acknowledging that we're both already in way too deep to pretend this is casual." She smiled. "How's that for non-committal commitment?" Hadrian laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "I'll take it." He drove her home as the city woke around them, and when they reached her apartment building, he walked her to her door despite the climbing sun. "Sleep," he commanded gently. "You've been through an ordeal, and you need rest. I'll contact you tomorrow evening." "Promise?" Fiona asked. "I promise." He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle press of cold lips that still managed to send heat through her entire body. "Dream of me." That's probably inevitable at this point. Fiona watched him leave, then dragged herself inside and collapsed into bed. She slept for 12 hours straight, dreamless and deep, and woke feeling more rested than she had in weeks. True to his word, Hadrian called that evening. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice warm even through the phone. Sore, tired, but okay. How about you? Recovered from the UV taser?" "Fully healed, one of the benefits of our biology." There was a pause. "Fiona, I've been thinking about what comes next. Marcus Kane is in custody and he's already starting to talk. The trafficking operation is being dismantled. But But there's more to this, Fiona finished. The purification front, the vampire who provided them with information, the larger conspiracy. Exactly. I need to follow these threads to their source, which means going deeper into vampire politics than is necessarily safe for a human. His tone turned serious. I want you involved. You've proven yourself invaluable, but I also need to know you understand the risks. Tell me what you need, Fiona said without hesitation. Come to a meeting tomorrow night at the Vampire Council chambers beneath the city. I'm calling an emergency session to address the trafficking situation and the breaches in our security. I want you there as both a witness and an advisor. You want me to address the Vampire Council? Fiona's voice rose slightly. Hadrian, I'm just an architect. What could I possibly contribute? You're not just an architect. You're someone who sees connections, who thinks strategically, who has proven she'll risk everything for justice. His voice softened. And you're the woman I trust more than anyone else right now. So yes, I want you there. The meeting was held in a chamber that looked like it belonged in a Gothic cathedral, all vaulted ceilings and stone columns and elaborate carvings. The Vampire Council consisted of 7 members, each representing a different region or faction, and they all looked at Fiona with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. A human, one of them said, a woman with pale hair, even longer than Hadrian's, and eyes like chips of ice. You bring a human to our council, Hadrian. Have you gone mad? Fiona Crawford is here at my invitation, Isolde, Hadrian said calmly from his seat at the head of the table. She has vital information about the trafficking operation and the purification front. More importantly, she has my trust. Your trust? Another council member, a man who looked Mediterranean with olive skin turned pale by vampirism, leaned forward. Forgive me, my king, but we've heard rumors that you've been seen with this human repeatedly, that you've fed from her, that you've become attached. The nature of my relationship with Miss Crawford is not up for discussion, Vincenzo, Hadrian said, his tone brooking no argument. What is up for discussion is how the purification front obtained information about our gathering at the Manor, how they acquired vampire technology, and who is betraying us from within. That got everyone's attention. The council members exchanged glances, their expressions wary. You're certain there's a traitor? Isolde asked. Absolutely certain, Hadrian gestured to Fiona. Tell them what we found. Fiona stepped forward, trying not to show her nervousness. The fire at the Manor was started using a chemical accelerant that doesn't show up on standard human tests. The attackers at the ruins had UV weapons of a sophistication that suggests vampire engineering. And Marcus Kane, the human running the trafficking operation, knew exactly when and where to expect us information he could only have obtained from someone inside your community. This is troubling, Vincenzo admitted. But what proof do you have beyond circumstantial evidence? I have this. Hadrian pulled up an image on a large screen at the end of the room, a document with vampire writing. This was recovered from Kane's warehouse. It's a receipt for a shipment of UV weapons signed by a vampire named Dorian Thorne. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Isolde looked genuinely stunned. Dorian Thorne? But he's one of our most trusted weapons developers. He's been with us for over a century. And he's been selling our technology to human extremists for profit, Hadrian said coldly. I have proof of at least a dozen transactions over the past 5 years. He's also the one who leaked the information about the Manor gathering. Where is Thorne now? Demanded another council member, a woman with dark skin and gold eyes. In custody in my private holdings, Hadrian replied, secured and awaiting the council's judgment. This is unprecedented, Isolde said, looking shaken. A vampire betraying his own kind to humans bent on our destruction. What could possibly motivate such treachery? Greed, Fiona said quietly. It's always greed. He was making a fortune selling weapons and information. He didn't care about the consequences. And you're sure there's no one else involved? Vincenzo asked. No other traitors in our midst? Not that we've found evidence of, Hadrian said. But we need to implement new security protocols, new vetting procedures. We've been too complacent, too trusting. The council debated for the next hour, discussing measures to prevent future breaches and what to do about Thorne. Fiona listened, fascinated by the blend of modern concerns and ancient customs in their deliberations. These were beings who had lived for centuries, yet they had to navigate a modern world that was increasingly difficult to hide in. Finally, they reached a verdict. Thorne would be stripped of his position and exiled from vampire society, forbidden from any contact with their kind. It was considered a punishment worse than death for a social species, and Fiona could see the gravity of it in every council member's face. "One more thing," Hadrian said as the meeting was concluding. "The attack at the Manor, the trafficking operation, these weren't isolated incidents. There's a broader movement growing, humans and vampires who benefit from chaos and want to tear down the peace we've built. We need to be vigilant." "Agreed," Isolde said, her icy demeanor thawing slightly. "And perhaps," she glanced at Fiona, "perhaps we need more allies like Miss Crawford, humans who understand both worlds and can help us bridge the gap." It was as close to an olive branch as Fiona was going to get, and she accepted it with a nod. "I'm happy to help however I can." After the council dispersed, Hadrian walked Fiona through the underground passages back to the surface. The corridors were beautiful in their ancient way, lit by electric lights designed to look like torches, with tapestries and artwork adorning the walls. "You did well in there," Hadrian said. "The council can be intimidating, but you held your own." "They're protective of you," Fiona observed, "worried about you getting too close to a human." "Yes, vampires have long memories, and there are plenty of historical examples of humans betraying vampires, or vampires becoming too enamored with humans and neglecting their duties." He stopped, turning to face her. "But you're not a betrayal waiting to happen, and I'm not neglecting anything. If anything, you make me better at my duties." "How so?" "You remind me why I took this position in the first place. To protect people both human and vampire. To build a better world than the bloody centuries I lived through." His hand came up to cup her cheek. "You make me want to be worthy of this crown I wear." Fiona leaned into his touch, marveling at how quickly she'd become accustomed to his coldness. "You're already worthy, Hadrian. You've proven that 100 times over." They emerged into the night air, and Hadrian's car was waiting. He drove her home again, but this time when they reached her building, he parked and turned to her with an expression of barely contained intensity. "I want to court you properly," he said. "No more just meeting up for investigations or emergency council sessions. I want to take you to dinner, to the theater, to show you my world and learn more about yours. I want this," he gestured between them, "to be real, official." "Official?" Fiona couldn't help but smile. "That sounds very formal." "I'm a 500-year-old vampire king. I don't really do casual." But there was warmth in his eyes that belied the formal words. "What do you say?" "I say yes, on one condition." "Name it." "You let me take you somewhere too, somewhere from my world, not yours. Something normal and modern and probably ridiculous by your standards." Hadrian laughed. "Done. When do we start?" "How about this weekend? I'll plan something and it'll be a surprise." "I look forward to it." He walked her to her door again, and this time when he kissed her goodbye, it was deeper, more claiming. Fiona felt it all the way to her toes, and when he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. "Soon," he promised, his voice rough. "Soon I'm going to ask you to let me in properly, to be with you without holding back. But not yet. Not until you're absolutely certain this is what you want." "I'm already certain," Fiona said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "Then soon," he repeated, and disappeared into the night. The weekend arrived with perfect weather, and Fiona took Hadrian to the place she'd chosen, a vintage arcade filled with old video games and pinball machines, complete with pizza and loud music. Hadrian stared at the chaos of lights and sounds with an expression of complete bewilderment. "This is your idea of a date?" "This is my idea of fun," Fiona corrected, pulling him toward a racing game. "Come on, Your Majesty. Let's see if 500 years of existence has given you good reflexes." It turned out that Hadrian's reflexes were excellent, but he had no idea how video games worked. Watching him try to navigate a simple side-scroller was hilarious, and Fiona found herself laughing harder than she had in years. "This is impossible," Hadrian declared after his character died for the 5th time. "How are children expected to master this?" "Practice and not taking it too seriously," Fiona said, bumping his shoulder with hers. "Here, try this one. It's easier." They spent 2 hours playing games, eating greasy pizza, and generally acting like normal people on a date. Hadrian slowly relaxed, his formal demeanor giving way to something more playful. By the time they left, he was actually smiling a real, unguarded smile that transformed his entire face. "I can't remember the last time I did something just for fun," he admitted as they walked through the night streets. "Usually, every outing has a purpose, an agenda. This was nice. We should do it more often then. Balance out all the life or death drama with some pointless fun." "I'd like that." He pulled her close, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Thank you for reminding me how to be something other than a king." They returned to his penthouse that night, neither wanting the evening to end. Hadrian poured wine, a vintage that was probably older than Fiona's grandparents, and they sat on his balcony watching the city lights. "Tell me about your world," Fiona said. "Not the politics or the danger, but the beautiful parts. What do you love about being a vampire?" Hadrian considered the question, swirling his wine thoughtfully. "The perspective, I think. Knowing that I'll see the future unfold, that I can learn and grow and witness humanity's evolution. I've seen so much change, so much progress. Yes, there's been horror too, but also incredible beauty, art and music and innovation that takes my breath away." "Do you ever regret it? Being turned?" "Sometimes, especially at the beginning, when I was still adjusting and grieving my human life." He looked at her, his crimson eyes reflecting the city lights. "But less so now. Now I'm grateful for every year, every decade, because they've all led me here, to you." "That's either very romantic or very cheesy," Fiona said, trying to lighten the intense moment. It can be both." He set down his wine and turned to face her fully. "Fiona, I need to ask you something important, something I've been thinking about since the night I first fed from you." "What is it?" "In vampire culture, feeding is intimate, sacred. When we take blood from someone, we're not just sustaining ourselves, we're forming a bond. The bite marks I left on your wrist? In my world, those are a declaration of intent, a signal that you're under my protection and that I'm courting you." He took her hand, his thumb brushing over the faded scars. "I need to know if you understand what that means, because if you accept it, if you accept me, you'll become part of the vampire world permanently." Fiona's heart was racing, but her mind was clear. What exactly would that entail? Recognition by the vampire community as my partner, protection under vampire law, access to our world and its resources, but also, he paused, also becoming a target for anyone who wants to hurt me or undermine my authority. It would make your life more complicated, more dangerous. "It's already complicated and dangerous," Fiona pointed out, "and I'm not exactly eager to go back to my boring old life before all this. This isn't a decision to make lightly." "I know." Fiona stood, pacing to the edge of the balcony and looking out over the city. "My parents always told me I had too much courage and not enough caution, that I jumped into things without thinking them through." She turned back to face him. "But this doesn't feel like jumping. This feels like the most logical decision I've ever made. You make sense to me, Hadrian. This makes sense." He was beside her in an instant, his hands framing her face. "You make sense to me too, more than anything has in a very long time." The kiss that followed was different from the others, deeper, more desperate, full of promise and barely restrained hunger. Fiona pressed herself against him, her hands sliding into his white hair, and felt him growl softly against her mouth. "If you keep kissing me like that," Hadrian said against her lips, "I'm not going to be able to hold back much longer." "Then don't," Fiona breathed. "I'm sure, Hadrian. I've never been more sure of anything." What followed was a night that blurred together in sensation and emotion. Hadrian was gentle despite his obvious hunger, treating her like something precious and fragile even as passion consumed them both. And when he bit her again, this time on her throat, in a spot that he explained was reserved for true mates, Fiona felt the bond between them solidify into something unbreakable. "Mine," Hadrian murmured against her skin, his voice rough with emotion. "You're mine now, and I'm yours. For as long as you'll have me." "Forever sounds good," Fiona replied, and meant it. They spent the rest of the night talking, touching, exploring this new dimension of their relationship. As dawn approached, Fiona fell asleep in Hadrian's arms, feeling safer and more content than she had since her parents died. The next few weeks fell into a new rhythm. Fiona continued her work at the architecture firm, but now she also attended vampire council meetings as Hadrian's recognized partner. It was a strange double-life sketching building, designs by day and navigating supernatural politics by night, but Fiona found she thrived on the challenge. The purification front was slowly being dismantled, their cells raided by coordinated human-vampire law enforcement operations. Dorian Thorne had been exiled, and new security protocols were preventing further breaches. The trafficking operation was shut down completely, with the rescued victims receiving support and counseling. Everything seemed to be resolving itself neatly, which, of course, meant something was about to go wrong. The attack came on a Tuesday evening. Fiona was working late at the office again, putting finishing touches on a major project, when every window in the building suddenly shattered inward. She dove under her desk as glass rained down, her heart pounding with terror. Then she heard the screams from the floor below. Fiona's first instinct was to call Hadrian, but her phone was on her desk, and there were people in the building who needed help. She grabbed a fire extinguisher, the only weapon-like object available, and headed for the stairs. The floor below was chaos. People were running, bleeding from cuts, and several figures in black tactical gear were herding them toward the emergency exits. But these weren't rescuers. They were attackers, wearing the insignia Fiona had learned to recognize from the purification front. "Everyone out," one of them was shouting. "This building is coming down in 5 minutes. Move!" 5 minutes. They'd planted bombs. Fiona's mind raced. She couldn't fight trained operatives, but she could buy time. She pulled the fire alarm, adding to the chaos, then ran back to her floor. Her phone showed a text from Hadrian. "On my way, stay safe," sent just moments before. But 5 minutes might not be enough time for him to reach her, even at vampire speed. She needed to find the bombs and stop them, or at least slow them down. Fiona ran through the building, checking obvious locations. She found the first device in the server room, a sleek package of explosives with a digital timer ticking down. 4 minutes, 30 seconds. She didn't know how to disarm a bomb, but she knew buildings. The server room was on an exterior wall, with windows that opened to a fire escape. If she could move the bomb there, maybe the explosion would vent outward instead of bringing down the structure. Fiona grabbed the device, her hands shaking, and carried it to the window. It was heavy, awkward, and the timer seemed to be ticking faster than normal seconds. 3 minutes, 45 seconds. She shoved the bomb through the window onto the fire escape, then ran to find the next one. There had to be more. One device wouldn't bring down a whole building. She found the second bomb in the stairwell, and the third near the building's structural core. Each time, she moved them to locations where the explosion might be contained or directed away from critical supports. It was desperate, improvised, and probably stupid, but it was all she could think to do. The timer on the last bomb she found read 30 seconds when strong, cold hands grabbed her from behind. "What are you doing?" Hadrian demanded, appearing out of nowhere. "Bombs!" Fiona gasped. "The building, they're trying to bring it down. I moved them, but there might be more." Hadrian didn't wait for her to finish. He scooped her up and ran that impossible superhuman speed that turned the world into a blur. They were out of the building and a block away when the first explosion ripped through the night. The blast was enormous, shattering windows for blocks around. But the building didn't collapse. It shook. It burned, but the structure held because the bombs had been moved from their optimal positions. "You brilliant, reckless, impossible woman," Hadrian said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "You saved that building. You could have died." "Everyone got out," Fiona said, watching firefighters and emergency responders arriving. "I heard them evacuating, and I couldn't just run and let the whole building come down when people might still be nearby." "No, you couldn't, because you're you." He kissed her fiercely, then pulled back to examine her for injuries. "You're bleeding." Fiona looked down to see several cuts from flying glass, but nothing serious. "I'm okay, just scratches." "I'm going to find who did this," Hadrian said, his voice dropping into that deadly tone she'd heard before. "And I'm going to make them regret ever learning your name." "The purification front," Fiona said. "They were wearing the insignia. Hadrian, I thought we'd shut them down." "Most of their cells, yes, but there are always remnants. Fanatics who won't give up." His expression was grim. "This was targeted at you specifically. They knew this was your office, your building." The implication was chilling. "They're coming after me to hurt you." "Yes, and I should have anticipated this. I should have protected you better." He looked genuinely anguished, an expression that sat strangely on his usually composed features. "You can't protect me from everything," Fiona said gently, "and I won't live in fear. We'll deal with this threat like we've dealt with all the others." "No," Hadrian's tone was firm. "No more risks. You're moving into my penthouse where I can keep you safe. You're taking a leave of absence from work. I'm not hiding," Fiona interrupted. "That's not who I am, and you know it." They stared at each other, both stubborn, both scared in their own ways. Finally, Hadrian sighed. "At least agree to enhanced security. Vampire guards when you're at work, tracking spells, a direct line to me at all times." "That I can agree to," Fiona said. "Reasonable precautions, not total lockdown." "You're going to give me a heart attack and I'm already technically dead." Despite the circumstances, Fiona laughed. "Come on, let's give our statements to the police and then figure out our next move." The investigation into the bombing led them back to the Purification Front's remnants, and this time, Hadrian didn't hold back. Over the next 2 weeks, he systematically dismantled every remaining cell, using every resource at his disposal and calling in favors from vampire contacts across the country. Fiona helped coordinate the efforts, using her analytical mind to trace connections and predict the extremists' next moves. Together, they made a formidable team, and by the end of the month, the Purification Front had been completely neutralized. Their leaders were in custody, their funding sources exposed, and their weapons caches seized. "Is it really over?" Fiona asked one evening as they sat in Hadrian's penthouse, finally able to relax. "This particular threat, yes. But there will always be someone who wants to disrupt the peace between our species, or who sees opportunity in chaos." Hadrian pulled her closer against his side. "But we'll face those threats together." "Together," Fiona agreed. "I like the sound of that." "I want to show you something," Hadrian said, standing and offering his hand. "Come with me." He led her to a room in the penthouse she hadn't been in before, a study with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive desk. But he bypassed all of that, moving to what looked like a blank wall. "One of the privileges of being very old," Hadrian said with a slight smile, "is that you accumulate interesting things." He pressed a hidden switch, and the wall slid away to reveal another room beyond. This space was smaller, more intimate, and absolutely stunning. The walls were covered in artwork paintings that Fiona recognized from art history books, pieces that should have been in museums. There were sculptures, rare books, and in the center of it all, a painting that made her breath catch. It was a portrait of a young woman with dark hair and bright eyes, wearing old-fashioned clothing. She was beautiful, but what struck Fiona was the expression hope mixed with sadness, courage mixed with fear. "Who is she?" Fiona asked softly. "My sister," Hadrian said, his voice carrying centuries of grief. "Elena. She died of fever when she was 19, just a few years before I was turned. I had this commissioned from memory 50 years after she passed, when I finally had the means to honor her properly." Fiona looked at the painting with new understanding. "You've lost so many people. All immortals do. It's the burden we carry watching everyone we love grow old and die while we remain unchanged." He turned to her, his expression serious. "Which is why I need to ask you something important." Fiona's heart started beating faster. "What is it?" "There is a way for humans to become vampires, not the violent, traumatic way I was turned, but a controlled process that preserves the mind and soul. It's not something I offer lightly, it's a complete transformation, giving up sunlight and normal food and the life you've known." He took both her hands in his. "But it would mean we could be together properly, eternally." "You're asking if I want to become a vampire," Fiona said, her mind reeling. "I'm asking if you would consider it. Not now, this isn't a decision to rush. But in the future, if you decide you want forever with me, the option exists." His thumbs brushed over her knuckles. "I'm also telling you that if you choose to remain human, I'll love you for every year of your natural life, and then I'll grieve you for the rest of mine. Either way, I'm yours." Fiona looked into those crimson eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and devotion. This was real, more real than anything she'd experienced before. And while the idea of becoming a vampire was terrifying, the idea of growing old and leaving Hadrian behind was somehow worse. "I need time to think about it," she said honestly. to really understand what I'd be giving up and what I'd be gaining. Of course, take all the time you need. He kissed her forehead. I just wanted you to know it was possible, that we have options. They stood there surrounded by centuries of accumulated treasures, and Fiona felt the weight of history pressing down on her. But she also felt possibility, the chance for a future that most people could only dream about. Ask me again in a year, she said finally. Give me time to experience your world fully, to be absolutely certain. And if I still feel the same way, then we'll talk about it seriously, Hadrian finished. A year. I can wait a year. I've waited 5 centuries for you. What's one more year? The year that followed was the strangest and most wonderful of Fiona's life. She continued her work as an architect, but now she also served as an unofficial liaison between the human and vampire worlds. Her unique perspective, human but deeply integrated into vampire society, made her valuable for negotiating treaties and smoothing conflicts. She met vampires from all over the world, learned their histories and customs, and slowly began to understand the depth and complexity of their society. Some vampires were warm and welcoming, others cold and suspicious, but all of them treated her with respect once they learned she was Hadrian's chosen partner. And Hadrian himself was a constant revelation. She learned about his human life, his early years as a vampire, the struggles and triumphs that had shaped him into the leader he became. She saw him negotiate peace between warring vampire factions, show mercy to enemies who deserved none, and demonstrate the wisdom of his 500 years again and again. But she also saw his vulnerability, the way he watched sunrises with longing, the grief he carried for everyone he'd lost, the fear that she might ultimately choose mortality over being with him. He never pressured her, never brought up the question of transformation. Again, but she knew it was always there between them. For her part, Fiona threw herself into experiencing everything both worlds had to offer. She traveled with Hadrian to vampire enclaves in Europe, explored ancient underground cities, attended elegant balls that looked like they were from another century. But she also dragged him to rock concerts, county fairs, and every normal human experience she could think of. You're trying to test yourself, Hadrian observed one evening after she'd insisted they go to a crowded music festival. Seeing if you can give this up. Maybe, Fiona admitted. Is that wrong? No, it's smart. He pulled her close, despite the crowd around them. I want you to be certain, because once you transform, there's no going back. As the year anniversary of his question approached, Fiona found herself increasingly certain of her answer. Yes, she would miss sunlight. Yes, she would grieve the loss of her human life. But the thought of existing without Hadrian, of watching him face centuries alone while she aged and died, was unbearable. She made her decision 2 weeks before the anniversary, and she planned something special to tell him. Fiona arranged for them to return to where it all started, the rebuilt manor that had replaced the one destroyed by fire. The new structure was beautiful, a blend of classical elegance and modern safety features that Fiona herself had helped design as part of her firm's pro bono work. Why did you want to come here? Hadrian asked as they walked through the empty halls. The building wasn't open yet, wouldn't be for another month. Because this is where we met, Fiona said, leading him toward what had been the ballroom. Where you carried me through fire and smoke and saved my life. I remember. I also remember thinking you were either the bravest or most foolish woman I'd ever met. And what do you think now? I think you're both. And that I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. He pulled her close, his pale hair catching the moonlight streaming through the new windows. I've existed for 5 centuries, Fiona, and not one moment of those 5 centuries has meant as much to me as the past year with you. Good, Fiona said, her heart racing, because I have an answer to your question, the one you asked a year ago. Hadrian went very still. You do? Yes. Fiona reached up to cup his face, memorizing every detail of his features. I want forever with you. I want to be transformed. I want to be your partner, not just for my human lifetime, but for eternity. Are you certain? His voice was rough with emotion. Fiona, I'm certain, she interrupted. I've spent a year thinking about it, experiencing both worlds, understanding what I'd be giving up and what I'd be gaining. And I choose you. I choose us. Hadrian kissed her then, deep and passionate and full of relief and joy. When they finally broke apart, there were actual tears on his cheeks, something Fiona had never seen before. "I was so afraid you'd choose mortality," he admitted, "that I'd have to watch you grow old and die while I remained frozen in time." "Never," Fiona promised. "We're partners, remember? In this for the long haul." "The very long haul," Hadrian agreed with a watery laugh. "Centuries and centuries of putting up with each other. I can't think of anything I'd rather do." They stood there in the rebuilt ballroom, holding each other as moonlight painted everything silver and gold. Outside, the city hummed with life, unaware of the momentous decision being made in this quiet space. "When?" Hadrian asked. "When do you want to transform?" "Soon," Fiona said. "But there are things I need to do first. Say goodbye to my old life properly. Get my affairs in order. Maybe a month?" "A month," Hadrian agreed. "And then forever." The transformation process, Hadrian explained over the following weeks, was complex and required significant preparation. It wasn't as simple as being bitten. It required ritual, careful blood exchange, and a period of transition where Fiona would be vulnerable and changing. "It will hurt," Hadrian warned her as they made the final preparations. "Your body will die and be reborn as something new. It takes 3 days, and they won't be pleasant days." "I understand," Fiona said. She'd done her research, talked to other vampires who had chosen transformation, and knew what to expect. "I'm ready." The ritual took place in a specially prepared chamber beneath Hadrian's building, with the Vampire Council present as witnesses. Fiona said her goodbyes to the sun one final time, took care of all her human affairs, and then descended into the darkness to be reborn. Hadrian was right, it hurt. The transformation was agony, her body fighting against the change, even as it accepted the vampire blood flowing into her system. She burned with fever, froze with impossible cold, felt her heart slow and eventually stop beating. Through it all, Hadrian was there, holding her hand, talking to her in that ancient language she'd learned was his native tongue. "I'm here," he kept saying. "You're not alone. I've got you." On the 3rd day, Fiona opened her eyes to a world transformed. Colors were sharper, sounds clearer, every sense heightened to an almost overwhelming degree. And she was cold, so cold, but it didn't hurt. It felt right, like she'd been slightly too warm her entire human life and had finally found the perfect temperature. "Fiona?" Hadrian's voice was careful, hopeful. "Are you with me?" She turned to look at him and gasped. He'd always been beautiful, but now she could see him the way other vampires did. She could see the power radiating off him, the ancient strength, the terrible beauty of what he was. "I'm here," she said, and her voice sounded different, clearer, stronger. "Hadrian, I'm here." He pulled her into his arms, and she could feel his relief like a physical thing. "Welcome to eternity, my love." The adjustment to vampire life took time. Fiona had to learn to control her new strength, to manage the hunger for blood, to navigate the world with heightened senses. But Hadrian was patient, guiding her through each step, and the vampire community welcomed her as one of their own. She discovered that she loved being a vampire, loved the power, the grace, the way she could move through the world with confidence she'd never possessed as a human. She missed sunlight, yes, but she found beauty in the night that she'd never noticed before. And her work as an architect took on new dimensions. She could now design for both humans and vampires, creating spaces that served both communities. Her firm didn't know about her transformation. She'd arranged a long sabbatical before the change. But when she eventually returned, she introduced innovations that revolutionized modern architecture. Years passed, then decades. Fiona watched the world change around her, saw technology advance in ways that amazed even her ancient partner. She and Hadrian traveled the world together, experiencing everything they could, and their love only deepened with time. They faced challenges, of course. There were always threats, power-hungry vampires, fearful humans, natural disasters that tested their strength. But they faced everything together, partners in the truest sense of the word. And on the 100th anniversary of the night they met, the night flames devoured the manor's roof, and the vampire king carried her out through the smoke. They returned once more to that spot, now a memorial garden. "Do you ever regret it?" Hadrian asked, his arm around her waist. "Choosing this life?" Fiona looked up at the stars, brilliant in the night sky, and thought about everything that had happened since that fateful evening. The fear, the danger, the pain, but also the love, the adventure, the absolute certainty of knowing exactly where she belonged. "Not for a single moment," she said, turning to kiss him. "You saved my life that night, in more ways than one, and I'd choose you again and again, in every lifetime." "Good," Hadrian said, pulling her closer, "because you're stuck with me for eternity now." "Promise?" Fiona asked with a smile. "Promise." They stood there in the memorial garden, two immortal beings among the flowers and moonlight, and Fiona knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The girl who'd run into a burning building to save a stranger had found her own salvation in the arms of a vampire king, and together they would face whatever forever brought. The city sparkled around them, full of life and possibility. Somewhere in those streets, other stories were beginning, other humans and vampires finding their way to each other, building the future one connection at a time. The world was changing, becoming more integrated, more accepting, and Fiona and Hadrian were part of that change. But for now, in this quiet moment, there was only the two of them. Partners, lovers, eternal companions, the fire that had brought them together had forged something unbreakable, and nothing, not time, not danger, not even death itself, would ever tear them apart. As they walked back toward the city lights hand in hand, Fiona thought about that terrified girl who'd climbed into a burning building a century ago. That girl had been brave, yes, but she'd also been lost, searching for meaning in a life that felt empty. She'd found more than meaning in the years since. She'd found purpose, found family in the vampire community, found a love that transcended the boundaries between species and spanned centuries. She'd found home. "What are you thinking about?" Hadrian asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "How grateful I am for fires," Fiona said with a slight smile, "and smoke, and vampire kings who carry stubborn women to safety." "I think you mean the vampire king who fell irrevocably in love with said stubborn woman," Hadrian corrected. "That too." They reached Hadrian's car, a modern vehicle now, though he still drove it with the same confidence, and he opened the door for her with courtly grace that would never fade, no matter how many centuries passed. "Home?" he asked. Fiona looked at the man who had saved her life, stolen her heart, and given her eternity. "Home," she agreed, because home wasn't a place, not the penthouse, not the office, not any physical location. Home was this: the cold comfort of Hadrian's presence, the certainty of his love, the knowledge that no matter what challenges the future brought, they would face them together. The flames had devoured the manor's roof all those years ago, but from those ashes had risen something beautiful and eternal. A love story that began with fire and smoke and desperate rescue, and continued through transformation and danger and triumph, and would last for as long as stars lit the night sky. Forever, Fiona thought as they drove through the city streets. They had forever, and she intended to enjoy every moment of it.